Welcome to the Sage Thought Leadership Podcast. Experience support for confident business makers. Well, hi everyone, and welcome to our podcast. I'm Ed Kless, and with me today is Charles Lubar. Charles is a graduate of Yale University and Harvard Law School and holds a master's degree in taxation from Georgetown Law. For 2.5 years, he worked in the Chief Counsel's Office of the Internal Revenue Service in Washington, D.C. He spent 34 years as a partner for a global law firm, Morgan Lewis. Lubar also recently served as a senior counsel at McDermott, Will, and Emery. He was born and raised in Washington, D.C. He spent 2 years as an entrepreneur in Nairobi, Kenya, and has been a resident of London, England since 1971. Over 50 plus years of international tax practice in London, he has represented a substantial number of well-known entertainers with respect to their international tax and other issues, including Michael Jackson, the Muppets, and several contributors to James Bond films. Welcome to the Sage Thought Leadership Podcast, Charles Lubar.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be part of your system of podcasts.
Well, Charles, tell me, why did you do what you do? Especially maybe why did you go to Nairobi, Kenya?
Okay, that's actually a good starting question. I was practicing the Chief Counsel's Office of the Internal Revenue Service, a very high-profile job. A little bit bored. I had a 4-year commitment, and this was about 2.5 years in. I got excited about post-independence Kenya because I was involved in a diplomatic program in Washington, D.C. My first wife was co-chairman of a young adults program for diplomats under 40. The chairman was a friend of ours, and she was married to a Kikuyu, which is the tribe of Jomo Kenyatta, the subclan, even the subclan of Jomo Kenyatta, the Kiambu Kikuyus. And he was a fascinating character, getting a PhD in political science, broadcasting in Swahili, Voice of America, teaching African politics at the University of Virginia. But all he wanted to do was to go into business when he got his PhD. So I got intrigued with the history of post-independence Kenya. And this guy was a pretty compelling human being. And we agreed to set up a little Kenyan corporation to do some things that he had identified as an interesting entrepreneurial activity. So I raised money with some crazy friends of mine in Washington, and I quit the Internal Revenue Service and moved to Nairobi with a wife and a 12-week-old baby to try to really provide a role for the African entrepreneur as he was taking over from the Indian. And we built houses, we got into small-scale manufacturing, and it was pretty exciting. It was very difficult to do, to really build up a business in Black Africa at the time, and these emerging countries that had gained independence mostly from the British, sometimes from the French. And I did it for a couple of years, but I was not, however, prepared to spend the rest of my life in Nairobi, Kenya. And so I thought I really had to leave 2 years down the line. And then even I wasn't sure what I was going to do. But I did have some contacts in Europe. My first wife was prepared to experiment again in Europe to see what happened. And I was fortunate enough in finding an unusual boutique law firm that was run by two Americans. It was setting up by two Americans. One was a corporate transactional lawyer, and the other was a famous entertainment lawyer. And they literally, as I say, hired me off the streets as their tax lawyer to help build a practice. And that was in 1971. And I worked with them for several years, built up a practice inside the corporate and entertainment firm, a little bit of a tax practice on foreign people living and working in the UK, Americans living and working in the UK, some UK people going outside. And I had ended up with a big dosage of exposure to the entertainment industry, certainly motion pictures first, films, then television, and then eventually much in the music world.
Which leads me to your book. So tell me about your book, An Improbable Journey, Music, Money, and the Law.
It's improbable because most people that had my sort of targeted lifestyle, he usually parlayed that into going into Wall Street or going into government or something like that. And I quit and I did something crazy. And I thought I would be treated as doing something crazy by my contemporaries. But in fact, it was the opposite. They thought it was pretty exciting. And they supported me in their own way, but it was an introspection into their own lives, because they would say something like, gee, that's so exciting. I wish we could have done something like that, but I owe school debts. I got married early. I had a kid, or I didn't have the nerve to do it. So anyway, what happened was I got involved in doing so much entertainment work. I eventually decided to set up my own practice. So I split off from this little firm, set up my own independent practice as really an international tax lawyer with some specialty in cross-border problem solving. And that was everything from Americans living and working in the UK, foreign entertainers coming to the UK to perform, and some was straight corporate work, American companies doing business abroad. And that's what I did for 6-7 years, when I was approached by one of the major law firms in the United States, Morgan Lewis, out of Philadelphia. And they asked me to set up their first office outside the United States, which is quite an honor, but I wasn't sure I wanted to do it until I met some pretty exciting people inside the firm, all of whom were different, but shared the same drive to build Morgan Lewis as a practice outside the United States. So I merged my practice, joined them, and ran the office for most of the 34 years I was with them. And then finally retired. I retired at 74, but I still wasn't finished with my legal work. And I joined then a very fine boutique private client practice in London, but part of another big American firm called McDermott, Will, and Emery. Morgan Lewis was out of Philadelphia. McDermott was out of Chicago, but they both had offices in London. Anyway, as a result of that, I got involved in some pretty interesting stuff, which was the theme, which turned out to be the reason I did the book.
Well, talk a little bit about your work with the Muppets.
Okay. Well, I set the Muppets up in the United Kingdom. Jim Henson had all the Muppet characters, which he had licensed to Sesame Street, a very successful program in the United States. He wanted to set up his own television series, but he couldn't find anybody in the United States who would finance it. So I don't know how he got the contact, but he got into contact with Sir Lou Grade, a big entrepreneur in the UK who controlled a big communications group, including a television group, and he was willing to finance the Muppets for a year. But, of course, structuring something for the Muppets, which means structuring something for 30 puppeteers in situations where they didn't just wave their fingers through a puppet, but they maybe dealt with the arms and legs, or maybe wrote scripts and did different participations in building the programs. So I had to figure out how they were taxed, and I negotiated lots of arrangements with the Internal Revenue Service to deal with the taxation of puppeteers, including Miss Piggy, and and at the same time, I had to do the corporate structuring, which was setting up a foreign business for the Muppets through their parent company, the Henson Associates. So that was that was a good job, I think. I mean, it was one of my earliest complex structuring, and we did it in a way that basically moved most of the value of what we did which would have been the copyrights in the underlying shows, back to the United States, where there was a much more tolerant, less oppressive tax regime. So that was one. And then, actually, there is an interesting story here. After we did the Muppet Show, I was asked by the general counsel to do some structuring for a couple of films. You may remember the first Muppet movie was a rousing success. And so they asked me to set the structuring up for that, along with the structuring for a Flight of Fancy of Jim Henson, the founder of the Muppets. He had an interest in a weird, dark film called The Dark Crystal. So I figured, and this I think was the right reading at the time, that we would do The Dark Crystal in the United States because it had a big budget and it was very unlikely to be successful. So we would say, okay, Jim, you've had your Flight of Fancy and you can write off all the costs against your income in the US. But the second Muppet movie was a guaranteed success because the first Muppet movie was so successful. So I set up a complicated structure through the Netherlands Antilles and a Dutch company and production in London. And it was really designed to move whatever profit element there was outside the United States and not immediately taxed unless brought back into the United States. Of course, and this I like to tell on myself, I got it completely wrong. My business strategy or my tax strategy interfered with the realities of the business world, and the second Muppet movie bombed, so I had my losses outside the United States. And The Dark Crystal turned out to be the sleeper film of, I think, 1982 and made a fortune. So I tell that on myself because despite whatever sophistication was involved in tax strategy, you still have to get a little lucky and sometimes a little prophetic in the business world.
And Charles, we have an exit question that we ask all of our guests, and that is, who's a hero of yours and why are they a hero?
I guess I'd say Miss Piggy is a hero. Heroine, because she was hysterically funny. She knew how to seduce men. Well, in fairness, I don't really have any heroes. I think people have affected my life quite a bit, and I had a lot of respect from people like my father, for one, who taught me how to. I think he gave me a good sense of what I would call personal democracy, which is dealing with people based on their individuality rather than anything that otherwise described them, whether that was race, religion, ethnic background, or the nature of the way they grew up themselves. So it gave me that sense of personal democracy, which has been really good for me, I think, over the years that I've been abroad, because I've been abroad over 50 years. And some of the people I met were at first blush maybe questionable in the eyes of the public. Like my African partner was a former Mau Mau who helped. It was a child, but that was the revolution against British colonialism, and they have had a pretty torrid reputation, but. This is a guy I went into partnership and trusted him with my life, and the same thing was, true of others. I mean, I represented a couple of the great pornography stars, 70s and 80s, Linda Lovelace and Marilyn Chambers, and their common husband, Chuck Traynor. And you'd say, well, how could you represent those kind of people and so forth? But the reality was there was some real talent and some real humaneness in both Linda Lovelace, in terms of her humaneness, and Marilyn Chambers in terms of her talent. She was an off-Broadway actress. She wrote her own material for a lot of stuff. She just made her income from hardcore pornography. Well, I didn't hold that against her. Go ahead.
And lastly, Charles, how can somebody contact you?
Oh, okay. Well, first, the book you can get And it's a pretty entertaining read. I mean, I've barely touched on it. I have been I've done a lot of stuff for a lot of different people in the entertainment industry and other fields. But you can get it on Amazon. It was released already in the United States June 20th, and it'll be released August 17th here in the UK. If you want to reach me, I mean, I have actually retired as a lawyer with McDermott, Will, and Emery, but I do have an email if people want to contact me and have any questions about it. The easiest would be charleslubar@gmail.com.
All right. Charles Lubar, thanks so much for being a guest on the Sage Thought Leadership Podcast.
I'm happy to have had a good time with you. Okay.
Review and subscribe by searching your podcast player of choice for Sage Thought Leadership Podcast.